Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar. It gets hotter every year, How to Proactively Fund the Heat Crisis. My name is Tanya Gulliver Garcia, and my pronouns are she, they. I combine my practical, academic, lived, and philanthropic understandings of disasters in my work as CDP's Director of Learning and Partnerships. I'm a self-described disaster junkie who's passionate about ensuring the most marginalized and vulnerable in our communities can recover and build resilience. My work is grounded in principles of equity and an understanding of how the intersections of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, class, and so much more impact the lives of individuals and their families or communities. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them at the end of the panel presentation. At the end of the webinar, there's going to be a short survey. It's probably already popped up in another screen right now. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to meet your needs better. Finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and our YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is also available now in English and several other languages. You can click on closed caption or live transcript to access it. This webinar has been co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Philanthropy New York, and United Philanthropy Forum, and we thank them all for their support. We couldn't do it without you. And as we begin our webinar, CDP acknowledges that it's working on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has also caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacy, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders, past, present, and future generations. So these were the goals we posted on the registration page. At the end of this webinar, we hope you'll have a greater understanding of the links between climate change and heat, learn how philanthropy can help address heat's impacts globally, and build awareness of the inequitable impacts of extreme heat. So let's take a look at the slide. So this is great to see. 61% of folks who answered the poll say that they are involved in responding to extreme heat in some way. 23% said no, and 16% said not sure, which means I think there's lots for all of us to learn from our speakers. And then, have you ever personally experienced negative impacts from extreme heat? 2/3 of us, over 2/3 really, have experienced that, and 28% have not. So very lucky for those folks who've not experienced that yet. Before we introduce our speakers today, I wanted to provide some context and background to this topic. I am super excited to discuss the topic of extreme heat. It's an area I've been working on for almost 20 years. I began my study in connection to extreme heat in conjunction with the homelessness crisis in Toronto after the deaths of some homeless and marginally housed folks. And we found out that heat deaths in Toronto actually exceeded cold deaths by 120 heat to 105 annual cold deaths. So even in a northern city such as Toronto, this was a crisis, but very little was being done. This quote on the page you can see is something I said to the Toronto Board of Health in April 2007. And 17 years later, this has definitely been proven true. And the picture of my arm there is a promise to one of our speakers. I said I would share it, but this is a heat tattoo I got, which represents the work I did to get my degree, which was based on extreme heat. So what is extreme heat? There's actually no standard definition of what a heat wave is or what extreme heat is. Instead, it varies depending on what's considered average for a particular place at that time of year. One day I discovered that what's extremely hot in Toronto is only slightly warm in New Orleans. So it's really about, and you can see there's some various definitions. It means that not having a common definition and everyone having different experiences also means that there's not a one size fits all solution. And our speakers are going to talk about some of that today. The knowledge of heat's impacts and the desire to create solutions to it really links to marginalized population through two heat waves. In Chicago in 1995, over 700 people died in just a few days. And Eric Kleinenberg's work that I show there, Heat Wave, examined the various social conditions that led to deaths, things like isolation, poverty, crime, and the lack of a personal safety network. And then very similarly, the statistics for the European heat wave of 2003, which depending on the numbers you look at, killed up to 70,000 people, showed that older adults, especially those that were isolated, living in poverty, or had physical disabilities, were at increased risk from death, especially in communities that don't typically have extremely hot weather. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our special guests, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Nidhi Upadhyaya is the Deputy Director for Global Policy and Finance at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arshrock Foundation Resilience Center. She manages the center's global policy and finance pillar and its engagement in India on climate resilience. As part of the United Nations Race to Resilience campaign in 2021, she supported systems transformation solutions to achieve the campaign's goal of building the resilience of 4 billion people vulnerable to climate change. Nidhi has co-authored several pieces of research on climate adaptation financing, and we'll share some of the links with you. Braden Kay is the new Extreme Heat Program Manager in the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Recently, he was the founding Sustainability and Resilience Director for the city of Tempe in Arizona, which included building programs in youth climate action, energy equity, local food, and resilience to extreme heat. Braden serves on the Local Initiative Support Commission's Emerging Leaders Council, the International Well Buildings Institute Advisory Board, and is co-chair of the Western Adaptation Alliance. And last but not least, Joseph Karanja is a PhD candidate at Arizona State University, whose research focuses on heat modeling designs and how they impact our understanding of the drivers of heat vulnerability and eventually heat outcomes. Currently, his research uses spatial statistics to understand the role of the geographical context and the personal exposures attributes that influence heat vulnerability. Additionally, he's a member of the board of the Urban Environment at the American Meteorological Society and a Bill Anderson Fund Fellow. So pleased to speak with all of you today. Braden, let me start with you. Extreme heat has different definitions and impacts in every community. What does it mean in California?
Tanya, thanks so much for having me here. I think one of the most important things that you've mentioned is that heat shows up so differently across the world, across the country, and even in California. And so, one of the things as I've come to California in the last year after working in Arizona was learning of the heat impacts and heat deaths that have happened across the state. So on this slide, I have examples of Maria, who was farming grapes outside of Stockton, who at 17 years old died of heat exhaustion. The other picture to the right of her is Esteban Chavez, who a day after his 24th birthday died from heat exhaustion as a delivery worker. There's Javon, who was a student in Lake Elsinore, who was asked at a school to run laps for wearing inappropriate gym clothing and passed away due to heat exhaustion. And then this is a couple of Jonathan and Ellen, who had recently moved from the Bay Area to Mariposa County to a more rural area, weren't as used to the heat in new hiking conditions. And when they went on a hike, passed away with their 1-year-old daughter and their dog. Photos that you don't see on this slide are of Californians and many across the country who are dying from, who are experiencing homelessness, and we're seeing a lot of heat deaths there. We're also seeing heat deaths in people mobile homes, and then we're also seeing a lot of heat deaths in people experiencing in people in older adults who are very heat vulnerable and also energy have heavy energy burdens and trouble with energy costs. And so one of the things to really understand is from, from labor, including farm workers, outdoor farm workers, outdoor workers like Esteban, we see tremendous heat impacts. We're seeing heat impacts from children through older adults. So heat is truly impacting all of California, and we need an all of government approach to deal with that heat. And so some of what you'll hear me today is talk about our statewide heat action plan, our communication strategy called Heat Ready California, a new heat warning system that we're developing, as well as this new funding opportunity we have called the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Grant Program. So, and really all of these efforts are a 58 county effort that really do need to be targeted towards very different conditions from what we see in the inland desert in Imperial County to what we see in Los Angeles, to what we see in the Bay Area, to what we see in the North. They all have, every county is impacted. It's the only climate hazard where every county is impacted in California, and the impacts look different depending on whether you have air conditioning or not, what your housing conditions are, and therefore solutions really need to meet the diversity of those needs.
Thank you. And I think that really emphasizes the point that I want to make sure funders hear, which is it's different everywhere. And so the solution is going to be different everywhere. And yet there are some commonalities. And Joseph, I'd love to have you talk about who is most at risk for heat emergencies and why.
Thank you, Tanya. Perhaps I'll start by answering the latter part of your question. Why are people vulnerable to heat? And largely, I'll classify 3 reasons as to why people are susceptible to heat. One of them relates to locational characteristics. You might be familiar with different locations, like what you mentioned together with Brandon, that we've got specific locational characteristics that determine our level of thermal comfort. For instance, when you're in Florida, there's a combination of humidity and air temperature. If you're in Phoenix, you're experiencing dry heat. Other things that define our locational characteristics include like a tree coverage, which determines shade or no shade or access to shade. And then we've got the effectiveness of existing intervening strategies. What I have on my slide here is one of the streets in Phoenix metropolitan area, and it's referred to as the zone where we mostly have the people experiencing homelessness. And they tend to use, like, for instance, here it's shown tents, protection against incoming radiation. And at times they have got additional cover, such as tarp, which is in blue here, meant to safeguard them against extreme heat. The second component that predisposes people to extreme heat is physiological profile. So we've got varying physiological profiles, and this includes the capacity to acclimatize to existing heat conditions, the sweating capacity of an individual, and the underlying health issues. And then thirdly, we've got the social demographic characteristics. Again, this is what creates differential health outcomes, and it's been argued from literature that hazard is a component of social economic constructs. And so this one creates differential capacity to even adapt. Specifically, you can point out the existing argument about the differences between the global north and the global south, and how these two divisions of the globe relate to susceptibility to heat. Specifically, as you can see in one of the experiments that we conducted, going back to my slide on the image where we've got the box plots, we can see that tap is the most used means or additional cover or shading feature by the people experiencing homelessness. And what we're seeing from one of our results is that it tends to have the highest air temperature. And so what we recommended from this research was that our research does not support the use of tents or tent covers as a protective means, especially when considering air temperature. Other specific populations that are at high heat risk include the people, like for instance, I've mentioned the people experiencing homelessness. And if you look at the historical historical context, like in the context of Maricopa, up to 40% of the heat-related deaths could be attributed to people experiencing homelessness. Secondly, we've got people with the occupational exposure, such as outdoor workers, construction workers, those working in farms, and airport workers. And then from the slide, we can see another group is the people who live in mobile homes. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to be able to meet the cost related, especially during the summers, related to sustaining of their AC units. We've got users of public transport, and largely this is related to their access to shading features. And then we've got the elderly, that is related to their physiological capability to acclimatize to the heat. And then people with existing comorbidities. And largely something else that is becoming a problem is the use of recreational or behavioral drugs. And like, for instance, the opioid crisis really puts certain groups of people at enhanced risk when it comes to heat. And then the last group is related to hikers and athletes who actively engage themselves in active activities that really predispose them or really, or rather makes them susceptible to heat because they are engaged in activities that enhance their core body temperature. So largely, that's how I answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And I think that really ties a link to the pictures that Braden shared and who had died in California and in his work. Nidhi, let me bring you in. Arshrock is engaged on a project that has actually placed chief heat officers in at-risk communities around the globe. So can you tell me more about this initiative, including what is a chief heat officer?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Tanya. It is such a pleasure for me to be here discussing extreme heat and what we can do to address this challenge. Heat touches almost every government agency in some way, but is often, a siloed hazard. For example, the Department of Health in a city or state may be carrying out one heat-related project, but not be coordinating with the Department of Education or parks to maximize the impact and avoid conflicting actions. The Chief Heat Officer or CHO role, as we call it, was pioneered by Arshrock in partnership with city governments around the world to address this heat gap. CHOs work to coordinate city activities on heat, but also identify opportunities for action and catalyze new work on heat. They are the local champion on this issue. They draw public awareness of the threat, and they implement long-term heat risk reduction and cooling projects. One of the things that we're most excited about at Arshrock is that this concept has spread outside our group of partners. We partnered with 6 cities around the world to appoint CHOs starting in 2021, but the city of Los Angeles and the state of Arizona have also separately created similar roles. So I'll share a link for everyone to read more about it, but that's what a CHO does, and that's what the program is about.
Thank you so much. And Braden over in California is a heat role that's very similar, but for the whole state. So Braden, can you tell us a little bit about your role and what California is thinking it wants you to do?
Great. Well, we definitely have an all of government approach, and I am decidedly not a chief heat officer, but my role is definitely written in my role is to help heat efforts across state agencies. And one of the tools that we have to do that is California's statewide heat action plan. We're one of the first states to have a state heat action plan. Our first one was in 2013. Then we updated it in 2022. And recently SB 306 was passed, which means we're now going to be updating our heat action plan every 3 years. And the action plan has these 4 components: building public awareness and notification, so making sure people know about the heat waves that are coming. 2, strengthen community services and response. So there's an opportunity for resilience hubs and community resilience centers, the opportunity to make sure that people have the air conditioning and the different efforts different water and different efforts they need to manage a heat wave. So some of the more traditional emergency management approaches. Then there's also the need to transform our built environment. Eleni, the chief heat officer that you just heard out from Arch Rock, talks about the need to transform the built environment. And she also talks about the need to have a revolution in landscape architecture. And she's absolutely right about that. And so we both need to change our built environment. That's cool pavements and cool roofs and smart materials, how we build buildings, how we orient buildings. There's so much in how we cool our buildings, whether it's through passive cooling or air conditioning. There's so much we can do in our built environment. And then there's also the nature-based solutions work, where we have the opportunity to retrofit our cities' landscapes, where we have the opportunity to help with landscapes that are going to do better in hotter and drier conditions while still keeping us as shaded and cool as possible. So that's one of the incredible things about this heat work. It's very diverse. It's everything from helping homeless people or elderly adults in response, to community awareness in many, many languages and meeting people where they're at, to these transformations in landscape and the built environment. So the people that we're hiring to do this work have to be kind of jacks of all trades in this way. But that's one of the things that we're seeing is, how do you find people and programs that can balance this need for immediate response to save lives this summer, while also understanding that some of this work is generational, multi-decadal work. We are going to be living with extreme heat for hundreds of years. And so we need to be making changes in our built environment and making the societal community resilience changes that we need in order to prepare for hundreds of years of change, as well as saving lives next summer or this coming summer. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of all that's on the plate when it comes to our all-of-government approach to extreme heat in California.
Thank you. And I think, it's so important to be looking at all the different ways that you can think about this. I think you have another slide though. Adrian, if you can go forward. If you want to talk, Braden, a little bit about the vision, there's this slide and one more.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about the grant program that I've been charged with. So I am part of the Governor's Office of Planning Research. We have 3 climate grants that fit under this integrated climate adaptation planning program. And our grant is specifically designed to help tribes, community-based organizations, and local jurisdictions around extreme heat, meeting the work that's already happening. I think that's one thing that's really important for funders to understand. There is some level of extreme heat work already happening in the communities that you're going to be working in. And I really think it's important for us to talk about meeting the work where it's at, opposed to starting brand new work. And so we definitely are trying to support the existing movement for extreme heat, make sure that as we're doing that, we're doing immediate response work and that long-term resilience work, that we're working on the workforce development implications of creating the types of workforce that's necessary to build resilience to extreme heat. And at the end of the day, our grant program, even though it's this integrated climate program, public health is central to it, and making sure we're protecting the most vulnerable Californians from extreme heat is absolutely mission critical to what we do. Next slide. So with that, we've done listening across the state of California. We've partnered with our Office of Community Partnerships and Strategic Communications, which is a new office that works with CBOs across the state. We've been working with jurisdictions and climate professionals across the state and tribes. And we've developed these program values through those conversations. And a few of the ones that have really popped out to me that I think are so important. One is, if we're going to be transforming landscapes in California and in the country and across the world, that has to be done in partnerships with tribes and indigenous knowledge experts. There is so much innate knowledge about what our landscapes are, what they used to be, what types of plant materials, and what types of landscape configurations can be more resilient. And so in a non-extractive way, there is an opportunity to partner with tribes, to partner with indigenous knowledge experts, to really make sure that our work, when it comes to that landscape transformation we need, is really done in concert with indigenous knowledge experts and with tribes. Another critical piece to this work is the inclusion and language justice work. We are not communicating in the enough languages where they are spoken using trusted messengers. And the Office of Community Partnerships and Strategic Communications and their director, Yumi Sarah, has done an incredible job of moving this work forward across the state of California, of understanding that language justice is a critical issue when it comes to making sure that we're hiring and paying for the right translation services, the right interpreters, all of the things necessary to make sure that as new languages are coming into California, and new languages do come into California almost every year, that we're responding to that, and we have heat messaging in those languages. Another thing that I've learned a ton about is the need for the access and functional need community to be really heard and felt. The deaf community has very particular concerns when it comes to extreme heat. Obviously, with cooling centers and issues, people that need to rely on ADA facilities, there's a lot of certain facilities there and needs there. And we've also heard a lot from AARP and other folks that advocate for older adults about specific programs and needs that are met there. So it is so important that when you're funding this type of work, that you're in consultation with access and functional needs communities, that you're in consultation with CBOs that represent language diversity, and that you're really trying to make sure that those programs are meeting all of the needs of the state, all of the needs in the jurisdiction you're working in. And then one last thing I want to mention, or two more things I want to mention. As you saw me talk about today, you know, every day we have communities that are still reeling from the losses that they've experienced in extreme heat. So there's a huge opportunity to work on harm reduction and healing. We've started to try to incorporate social workers into all of the grants that we're looking for, so that if you're doing planning work, you're also doing healing work with healing professionals or the healing arts or with social workers. So it's a really important aspect that I think sometimes gets left out when we think about doing this type of climate work. And then lastly, something I think is really important is when you work on heat, you're building community resilience for all hazards. And there's a lot of conservative communities in California and across the country that aren't ready to take climate action. They don't want to talk about climate, they don't want to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but they are willing to save lives when it comes to heat. And heat can be an entry point to make sure that you're then ready for floods, or you're then ready for earthquakes, or you're then ready for the next pandemic. So I really do think that if folks are willing to fund heat preparedness as an entry point, you can get more communities that you wouldn't have been able to get if you came in talking about climate preparedness. So we really do feel like heat can be a gateway drug into helping some communities that aren't used to working on climate or have political reasons for not working on climate to actually take some of the precautionary measures that are really necessary. Thanks for letting me go long here on the slide.
Yeah, no problem. And Joseph, in a little bit, is going to talk about some of that interaction between heat and other hazards. But first, Nidhi, I want to go to you, and let's start thinking about some of the actual projects that are happening. So, can you tell me about the one you're involved with in India?
Yes, absolutely. So just so that the audience understands, during the summer, some cities in India sea temperatures rise up to 52 to 52 degrees Celsius. So that's around 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty high. At these temperatures, the human body is unable to function properly. And due to the many risks that heat poses, especially for women in vulnerable communities, we decided to address this issue and partnered with the Self-Employed Women's Association, or SEVA, and Blue Marble Microinsurance to deliver risk mitigation and transfer solutions to 21,000 women in the city of Ahmedabad, which is on the western part of the country. SEVA, just for context, is a trade union with over 2.6 million women members across 18 states of India, and they work across multiple trades. So they're market vendors, they're home-based workers, they're waste recyclers, salt pan workers, etc. These members, due to extreme heat, suffered from decreased work efficiency and work hours, increased expenses, spoilage of the goods that they trade in, and reduced work days because of illnesses. This resulted in a major decrease in incomes for these women. And these members also experienced heat-related illnesses like dehydration, skin rashes, urinary tract infections, blisters on their hands, which also, it showed that they couldn't work in these conditions at all. It also had an increase in mental health issues and substance abuse. I think some of the things that were already mentioned. So what we came up with as a solution is the world's first parametric insurance aimed at recovering lost wages due to extreme heat. We also recognized that a successful risk management strategy also included risk reduction. In this case, we tried it out with the provision of wraparound assets that included equipment like solar lamps or water coolers that allowed these women to reduce their exposure to extreme heat in the trades that they operate in. Even after these solutions and the risk is mitigated, there is residual risk. And that is what we're trying to address using the insurance, the parametric insurance product. The insurance needs to be informed by a strong heat and health early warning system, which is where we as Ashrock come in. One other key benefit that came out of this program was that the members of SEVA opened or reactivated dormant bank accounts. So there was a financial inclusion benefit for these women so that they could actually receive the benefits. The final few points that I'll make here is that given the impact that heat has on women and girls, our approach is to work alongside these communities to build solutions with them to achieve the intended impact we want, the long-term impact that we want, and the robust resilience we want to build in these communities. It's also important to understand that this is a solution that you cannot, or solutions of these kinds cannot be done alone, and it has to be done with a strong network of partners, backed by the extreme heat work from our team, the strong network of an organization like SEVA, and the trust that they have with their members, and the technical expertise of Blue Marble on insurance. We are in a very, very strong position to deliver a holistic approach to this project and create the impact that can directly benefit the physical and economic health of these women, as well as protecting their families. Lastly, we're hoping to scale. Our pilot was done last year, and we're hoping to scale this kind of a solution in other cities and regions, so catering to the local needs of different cities. But that's the project that we're doing in India currently.
Yeah, that's great. It's so fascinating. And Joseph, I want to ask you to talk about some of the research around how people are uniquely affected, because I think, as Nidhi just mentioned, there are unique effects that folks have.
Well, thank you. And just picking up from the conversation, and specifically from Braden's conversation, where he mentioned that heat experiences among people varies across locations and populations. And so as decision makers, the most important thing with the given limited resources, whom do we target whenever we have a heat hazard? And so that is the major question that I seek to address in my questions. And largely, I seek to advance the role of context or location in understanding the health implications related to heat hazard. So in my research, I look at the spatial dynamics of heat and how it changes over time and how this translates to unique personal exposure experiences. So why is this important? It's because as decision makers, one has to specifically target certain populations and locations, and hence the need for specially targeted interventions. And the other crucial component is that at times, we rely on existing indices to make decisions on whom we target. And in this regard, sometimes we don't have data that effectively captures all the attributes of a given population or location. And so one of the gaps that I seek to address is that data gap. And how do I go about it? It's trying to quantify the role of the geographical context. Context in this sense means non-measurable variables that influence our exposure to heat. This includes aspects such as attitudes, norms, and culture, which intrinsically affects our response capability. And so quantifying context is really one of the things that I try to do, and its influences on the heat experiences of different populations. The other thing is, if you need to, or if you want to effectively qualify narratives related to environmental justice or environmental equity, then you need to pick out these specific locations and populations. And so that is one of the contributions of my research. Also, heat is largely known to be or to have or manifest characteristics of intra-urban variability. So how do we go about determining the specific locations? We need to come up with models or research that are able to pick out the intra-urban nature of heat, so that our models should be able to capture the exact intrinsic characteristics associated with heat hazard, both in terms of meteorological components of the hazard and then the non-meteorological components of the hazard. The other thing, as you can see from these, is testing of existing interventions. And as I mentioned in the first slide, we wanted to replicate the exact street conditions in the city of Phoenix. For instance, here we have a setup of different shade covers that we try to replicate exact street condition using different tent shading features. And as you can see, we had 6 tent shade features, and then we wanted to compare the effectiveness of these tent shade features against the ambient conditions and against a control tent. In this regard, the control tent did not have any additional cover. And what we saw from or the key finding from our experimentation and through physiological modeling, we're able to see that if you are young and healthy, you are safe. You are relatively protected from the heat that you're exposed. However, when we did the physiological modeling including the effect of drug, is that you're able to move from this lower level of exposure to this yellow band. And if it's not clear, I'll just say this reflects mild heat stress. Now, going back to the initial question that you posed to me, how are different people uniquely affected? We see the effects of drug use here. So again, you're moving from the lower level of mild heat stress to heat stroke level. And these are findings that have been posted in a manuscript that is under review currently, and once it's out, I'll be glad to share with the audience. So here you're able to see how the research tries to narrow the gap from spatial dynamics attributable to heat to how this translates to personal heat exposure. And this is all important for targeted intervention given the limited resources that we have. The other crucial component is on validation and evaluation of existing indices. As I've mentioned, vulnerability or a hazard constitutes both the physical hazard itself and the socio-economic attributes associated with a given population and location. But how do these things interact? And how do we go beyond just looking at the indices? We need to come up with models or conceptualization that look at the interactions of these two, and coming up with empirical studies that leverage on the capability for validation and evaluation, so that we're able to know when we are making decisions on whom to target, what is the level of confidence that we have on the intervention that we are likely to deploy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And let me stay with you, because I think this is important, and Braden touched on this, you know, the different ways that heat also interacts with other hazards. And you've taken a look at that both at home in Kenya, but also in the US. So what are those, you know, problematic interactions between heat and other hazards?
Thank you so much again. So picking up from what was mentioned in the conversation was that if you target heat as a hazard, in some way you're also targeting other hazards. So one thing is that the hazard scape constitute both socioeconomic or socio-demographic attributes. And so if you're able to identify these vulnerable groups in some way, you are able to come up with solutions that will be scalable to different locations and to different hazards. Specifically when it comes to heat, as you're seeing from these slides, it's at times when we experience heat, we've got other associated hazards that come with it. One of them is wildfire risk, and the images here were taken from one of the summers in California specifically. So we tend to have the wildfire season in tandem with the heat hazard season. And so what you see is that a concurrence of two hazards, which need to be contextualized as one. Thirdly, as a result of the wildfire, we end up having air pollution, again, bringing in new dynamics or new nuances as to the concurrence of these hazards. So for decision makers and for researchers, we need to come up with conceptualizations again of models or interventions that look at the concurrence of all these hazards. And we need to think about the synergistic and compounding effects associated with these multiple hazards conceptualization and the eventual manifestations of different heat health outcomes. So we are not only looking at mortality, but all these hazards, either individually in isolation or as a result of their synergistic interactions, could have varied heat health outcomes. So how do we move from probably heat illnesses, or how does one or an individual move from heat illnesses to eventually maybe having heat-associated mortality? And so those are the sweet spots that research needs to come into and maybe provide more nuanced understanding. And so there is a need for multi-hazard conceptualization and consideration of these interactions. So these hazards are not only confined to particular spaces, and I can give the most recent example of the Canadian wildfire last year, which affected parts of the northern eastern region of the US. So as we think about localized interventions, we also need to think about these hazards, and that at times they do not confine themselves to certain geographical regions, but rather they've got the capability of being spread out. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, you know, to echo Braden's point as well, that when we talk about heat, we're not just talking about pure heat and temperatures. We're talking about the way that it impacts and can have an impact in a huge geography, as you just pointed out. And Nydia, let's move into some solutions. And I have one more question for you and one for Braden. What kinds of adaptation could public-private partnerships carry out if we had some really creative finance?
Yes, there are so many creative ways to go about doing adaptation. But before I jump into specific solution ideas, I wanted to share with you all this call for collaboration that we announced last year that focuses specifically on bringing together the public and private sector, especially on financing. So this call is an opportunity for these sectors to come together and accelerate investment and action for climate resilience. This year-long process included a great deal of discussion around how the two sectors can work together, identifying gaps and leveraging opportunities. As we all know, there's a greater need for collaboration between the two sectors, but very often there needs to be a space for them, a platform for them to come together and brainstorm ideas. So the process we did last year was exactly that, where we had very open, very fruitful conversations between the two sectors of let's do something about this. So coming to solutions, local companies can do a lot without investing a huge amount of money. For example, partnerships with cities to fund neighborhood block parties on hot days, which have been shown to save lives because they keep people from being trapped alone in air-conditioned apartments. Or even giving employees the chance to volunteer during heat waves could have a huge impact. For example, employees could staff heat health hotlines or take part in response activities. Employees and companies also have certain skills, whether you take tech companies or health companies, to volunteer for nonprofits or civil society organizations to provide support through those skills. Larger companies and philanthropy can also engage on initiatives ranging from tree reforestation and maintenance, supporting the creation of resilience hubs and cooling centers. I know Braden mentioned a few of these, or developing health-focused initiatives. Foundations and philanthropists in particular could look at partnering with their city to split the cost of appointing a chief heat officer for maybe a 1 to 3 year period. Additionally, I think developing policy frameworks that support efforts to measure, address, and mitigate physical climate risks and quantify the resilience benefits, and also integrating adaptation and resilience metrics into financial decision-making processes, or building the enabling environments that incentivize adaptation and resilience action, including data and tools to allow investments to be identified and for the finance to flow. So these are just some ideas that we could think through, but I'm sure there are many more.
I think there's probably more ideas than we can talk about today. But we're going to hear from some of them from Braden. Before that, though, after this, we're going to go to the question and answer section. So please make sure you put your questions in the Q&A. So Braden, you have small and large planning and implementation grants, and some of these I think would align with the kinds of things funders could quite easily do. So can you share a few examples of projects that you have?
Yeah, and so, one of the things that as we were learning, the Office of Planning and Research in our first several grant rounds with our other programs had been funding these like $500,000 planning grants. And what we heard was there were a lot of communities that were not ready for those larger grants that have bigger partnership requirements, and that there are actually a lot of communities that need their CBO to be talking more with their emergency management services, or their CBOs to be talking more with their public health agencies, or their public works, public health, and emergency management agencies to be in more dialogue together, or to update some of their planning efforts together. And so that we really felt that kind of small planning grant need was necessary. There's also there's also jurisdictions that just need to get something in the ground. They need shade structures at schools, or they need trees on their main streets, or they need water fountains and splash pads in their parks, and they can use a small type of implementation grant for that. So this first round of funding is a $20 million round. We're trying to figure out what our fall round of funding will be, whether we'll have an opportunity to do another round of funding. But this is money that came out of the Governor Newsom's $54 billion climate package out of the 2021 and 2022 budget cycles. Really exciting transformational opportunity to address climate change and with some really important resilience investments, including this extreme heat and resilience program. So next slide, some of the things to fund on the implementation side, we organize this in terms of the 4 tracks of our climate action plan. These are all different activities that you can do. You can also take these and combine them. So I love the fact that we just heard about the neighborhood resilience events for extreme heat. County of San Francisco has been doing that with a lot of high quality effects. So that's an example of the building public awareness work. We've also seen a lot of great work around arts and culture projects for awareness, youth empowerment. On the community response side, a lot of interest in mutual aid and very small grassroots CBOs that are allowing for first aid training, allowing for survival packs for people experiencing homelessness, or for the elderly, or for schools. There's a lot of opportunity on that response side. Next slide. Then we're also funding actual built environment changes, cool and smart surfaces, including cool pavements and cool roofs, shade structures, water fountains, splash pads. There's a big movement. We're going to see quite a few applications around transit shelters and enhanced transit shelters, as well as cool home pilot projects, different retrofits that you can do in the home to lower the heat burden and allow for cooling, whether that's fans or different types of new air conditioning systems, or just energy retrofits to lower the energy cost burden in a home so that they can shelter in place during a heat wave and use air conditioning. We have found, like in Maricopa County, a lot of the indoor heat desks, people have air conditioning, but it's not working. So there is a huge need for air conditioning retrofits and air conditioning supports, because a lot of the heat desks we're seeing, it's not that they don't have, some places don't have air conditioning. We see that in San Francisco and Northern California for sure, but we also see a problem with a lack of quality air conditioning services that can be a big problem. And then lastly, there is such a, if you're not funding nature-based solution work, consider it. Find a way for your philanthropy to get involved in nature-based solutions work. It's such an important piece of the puzzle. And there's so many great ways to bring communities and artists and indigenous knowledge experts and a lot of other experts in the community to help transform landscapes, tiny forests, cool community gardens. The city of Tucson and the city of Tempe, where I both used to be, have incredible green stormwater infrastructure programs. I can put some links to those in the chat. We have someone online, Jenny Vanos from Arizona State University, that has a heat-ready schools program that's been advocating for nature-based playgrounds and shaded playgrounds and basically retrofitting schools to be heat-ready. A lot of opportunities to bring nature-based solutions to schools. And then there's also been a huge need, which is interesting, to fund maintenance for nature-based solutions. So a lot of jurisdictions have told us already that they're going to be using our grant program to fund training for maintenance workers, to fund water availability for longer into the tree's life. A lot of opportunity. Right now, there's not budgets for maintenance, and maintenance can be a place where you can really help a community ensure that they have high quality and longer lasting nature-based solutions. So those are just some of the examples of the types of things that can get funded in this implementation space.
Thank you. This is really great. And I know when I ran a heat registry project in Toronto, we also ran an air conditioning program to get folks air conditioners, but the cost of the energy was a really big one in terms of once they had it. And we know that just a couple hours in air conditioning can make a real difference to someone's life. So let's go into some of these questions. One of the questions, and we've seen this repeatedly throughout this webinar, is the question of extreme heat and awareness for vulnerable communities. So people with disabilities, older adults. And then a similar question is, how can funders collaborate to address these extreme and unequal impacts? Joseph, do you want to try this one?
Sorry, could you come up again? I think I had a problem in my internet. Sorry.
Yeah, just with all of these groups like older adults or people with disabilities, how can funders work together or work to do education to support these groups? Okay, well, maybe Braden, do you want to tackle it while Joseph works on his sound there?
One of the things that we've been seeing that's been really interesting that the Office of Community Partnerships and Strategic Communications has been helping us with is community foundations are such an incredible collaborator and convener. So there's an opportunity, if you're a community foundation, there's an opportunity to help with that, bringing CBOs and local governments and different public health agencies and emergency managers together. If you're another type of funder, perhaps you want to consider partnerships with community foundations as a way of making sure that you are talking to the funders that are as close to the problem as possible and creating some partnerships in those spaces when possible. That's one thought.
Joseph, did you get sound back? Did you want to add anything to that?
I partly heard about grasp the question, but I think it's related to communities that are heat vulnerable.
Yeah, what kinds of things can we do to reach out to them to support them?
I think a model that I've seen here in the city of Phoenix and largely the whole of Maricopa County is getting in touch with these local community organizations. And one of the things that I see them doing is trying to come up with workshops where you're able to translate the ongoing research in the local universities and translating that and what it means to the local communities. And so bringing them on board or bringing them in the conversation, getting to fit and helping them co-design some of these intervening strategies. And also connected to that, testing out some of the interventions that they propose so that we have got a co-creation of intervention that incorporate community perspective as well as scientific research.
Great, thank you. Nidhi, one of the questions I saw a couple times is, folks are interested in this topic, but they don't know what to do. So with your Chief Heat Officers program, are there sample templates of a standard operating procedure, or, is anything published about the kinds of projects that you talked about or that Braden was talking about?
Yeah, I think one, at least from the policymaking perspective, a solutions perspective, we have a tool called the Heat Action Platform, which can be a great resource for people to look at case studies, but also to look at solutions of where they're located. So understanding what sort of area you're in, and then looking at those examples or solutions that are already out there. And to Braden's earlier point, let's not try to recreate the wheel. Let's use the solutions that already exist and see how we can work together to scale those efforts and bring them out more openly, and see how you can. This is also a great tool for funders to understand that there are solutions out there. There need to be more conversations around these solutions and to see how effectively they can be scaled. So I'll add the link to the Heat Action Platform as well, but it's a very handy tool for whether you're a chief heat officer or any other kind of policymaker to see how solutions are being implemented.
Thank you. And Braden put some resources in the chat. We'll make sure the resources are shared as well with everyone. So I want to move to next steps. We are running out of time and quickly getting close to the top of the hour. So here's some things that I heard when I talked to the speakers ahead of time. One was create a local plan, but also staff it. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to extreme heat because of diversity, but like Nidhi just said, there are examples. And funders can play a key role in convening a planning process, or, as Braden mentioned, tapping into something that's already ongoing. And then those programs, those ideas are going to need support. A plan is just a plan and sits on a shelf, or I guess in a file now on our computer, if there's no one to implement it. And as they've all talked about, it's so important to include at-risk communities in planning and response. And we talk a lot, I think, about including folks in the planning stage, getting input, but we also need to include them in other phases of the work. So Toronto's Heat Registry Manual was created by a group of psychiatric consumer survivors with experience of homelessness. They planned and implemented North America's first risk-based heat registry almost 15, 16 years ago now. And we needed that work funded to pay their wages, to do tokens, to do other supplies. And then consider the other impacts of some of our speakers have talked about. Wildfires, deforestation, drought, hurricanes, typhoons. There are a high number of hurricanes predicted for this year, and part of that is because of how warm the water is. So think about adopting and funding an all hazards approach. So we have numerous resources at CDP to assist you. Please check out our website at disasterphilanthropy.org so you can learn more. Next month, May 9th, we are going to hold a webinar on corporate disaster philanthropy. So be sure to check that out. Thanks to our co-sponsors, to Nidhi, Braden, and Joseph for your insights. Don't forget about the webinar survey. It's going to pop up. And if you have questions that we didn't address, you can either email them to me at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.